A millionaire widower tested his girlfriend by placing the twins in the care of the housekeeper. What he discovered about her jealousy shocked him, but his decision changed everything forever. A story that will move you. Subscribe, leave your like, and comment where you are watching from. The aroma of brewed coffee still lingered in the air of the mansion when Edward Smith closed the office door and headed to the twins' room. At 38 years old, his temples already displayed silver strands that contrasted with his dark brown eyes, always alert, always calculating. The 3-day stubble couldn't hide the tension he carried in his jaw, a reflection of the last 2 years spent amidst diapers, bottles, and business meetings. "Good morning, my princes," he murmured as he approached the crib where Michael and Ryan, his 8-month-old twin sons, were beginning to wake up. The duplex apartment in the Upper East Side, with its 4,300 square feet and privileged view of Central Park, felt too empty to accommodate just the three of them, and Mrs. Johnson, the housekeeper who had become much more than an employee. "Mr. Edward, did you sleep well?" asked Mrs. Johnson, a 52-year-old woman, short, with graying hair always tied up in a perfect bun. Her light brown eyes radiated the typical sweetness of the Midwest, but also a shrewdness honed by 5 years of working for wealthy families. "More or less, Mrs. Johnson. Did the boys wake up a lot during the night?" Edward adjusted his Gucci tie while watching his sons. Michael, always more restless, was already reaching out for a cuddle, while Ryan, more observant, gazed at him with those blue eyes identical to his mother's. "Ryan had a bit of a fever, but it's gone now. I gave him the medicine the pediatrician prescribed." Mrs. Johnson picked up Michael with the ease of someone who had raised 5 children of her own. "Mr. Edward, can I say something?" Edward stopped checking his emails on his phone. He recognized that tone from Mrs. Johnson. It was the same one she used when she wanted to address delicate matters. "Go ahead, Mrs. Johnson. Don't you think it's time to, I don't know, go out a bit, meet people? These boys need a mother, and you need a companion." The mention of the word mother made Edward swallow hard. He could still smell the gardenia perfume that Sarah used, still hear her laughter echoing through the empty halls. Leukemia had taken her in a matter of months, leaving him with 2 newborns and a void that no amount of money in his bank account could fill. "Mrs. Johnson, I don't—" Edward hesitated, looking at his sons. "How will I know if someone is interested in me or my money?" "Oh, Mr. Edward," Mrs. Johnson shook her head, though she understood his concern perfectly. She had worked for wealthy families long enough to know how money attracted people with dubious intentions. "You are a good man, hard-working, a dedicated father. Any woman would be lucky to have you." Edward walked over to the panoramic window of the room. Down below, the morning hustle of New York City was already taking over the streets. Hurrying executives, street vendors setting up their stalls, mothers taking children to school, a whole life he observed from afar, protected by his glass and concrete walls. "You know, Mrs. Johnson, sometimes I think about what it would be like if I were just normal. A regular guy who takes the bus, worries about gas prices, has to choose between paying the electric bill or buying a gift for his kids." Mrs. Johnson frowned, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. "You were never ordinary, Mr. Edward. Even when you were little and Mrs. Sarah told me stories about your youth, it was clear you would be special." "Special," Edward repeated the word bitterly. "Special and alone. You are not alone. You have these 2 treasures and you have me, and God willing you will find someone special too." Edward turned to her, an idea beginning to form in his mind. It was crazy, dangerous, but perhaps it was exactly what he needed. "Mrs. Johnson, would you take care of the boys if I went out this afternoon, not for a meeting, just to take a stroll, to see the city in a different way?" "Of course, Mr. Edward. It's great that you're finally going to get out a bit." Mrs. Johnson smiled, unaware of the plan that was beginning to take shape in her employer's mind. A few hours later, Edward parked his BMW in the underground garage of a shopping mall in Brooklyn and took the subway to the neighborhood. He had swapped his Italian suit for jeans and a polo shirt, leaving his Rolex and leather wallet at home. In his pocket, only some change and a debit card from a low-limit account he kept for emergencies. Brooklyn was buzzing with its characteristic mix of artists, students, and freelancers. Edward walked along the cobblestone streets, observing the graffiti on the walls, smelling the coffee wafting from the small establishments, listening to conversations about bills to pay and dreams to fulfill. It was when he entered the Corner Cafe, a small and cozy coffee shop on Harmony Street, that his life took a completely new direction. She was sitting, alone at a corner table, typing intently on an old laptop. Light brown hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, glasses that accentuated her green eyes, wearing a simple top and worn jeans. There was something in her posture, a mix of determination and vulnerability, that made Edward stop midway to the counter. "Excuse me," he said, approaching the table. "Sorry to bother you, but all the other tables are occupied. May I sit here?" She looked up from her laptop, quickly assessing him. Edward held his breath, waiting for her response. "Sure," she replied with a shy smile. "Just don't guarantee that I'm good company. I'm in the middle of a creative crisis." Edward sat down, extending his hand. "Edward Smith." "Emily," she replied, shaking his hand. "Emily Brown." Emily, a graphic designer, freelancer, and eternally struggling against impossible deadlines. "Nice to meet you, Emily. I work in construction." And so, with a simple lie, Edward Smith, one of the biggest real estate moguls in New York City, began the test that would change his life forever. 3 weeks had passed since their first meeting at the cafe, and Edward found himself counting the hours until his encounters with Emily. Sitting in his office on the 38th floor of the commercial building his construction company had erected on Fifth Avenue, he watched the bustling streets below while meticulously planning his double life. "Mr. Smith, you have a meeting with the investors for the Alphaville project in 15 minutes, announced his secretary, Mrs. Johnson, an efficient woman in her 40s who had worked with him for over a decade. "Cancel it," Edward replied, not taking his eyes off the window. "Reschedule for tomorrow morning." Mrs. Johnson frowned. In all her years of working with him, she had never seen her boss cancel an important meeting without a solid business justification. "Sir, it's the Koreans. They flew in from Seoul specifically for—" "Mrs. Johnson," Edward interrupted, turning to her with a smile he hadn't shown in months. "Have you ever wondered what life would be like if we were completely different people?" "Sir?" Mrs. Johnson adjusted her glasses, clearly confused. "Never mind. Just reschedule the meeting. And Mrs. Johnson, I need you to arrange a few things for me, discreetly." Edward opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out a paper where he had noted a detailed list. In recent days, he had planned every aspect of his new identity. "I need you to find an apartment for rent in Brooklyn. Nothing too luxurious. 1 or 2 bedrooms, furnished, in a regular building. The lease should be under the name Edward Silver. Prepare all the necessary documentation." Mrs. Johnson scribbled frantically, trying to understand the unusual request. "I also need a used car, a Chevrolet Onyx or something similar, a few years old, and arrange for a low-limit credit card, also under the name Edward Silver. May I ask what this is for, sir?" Edward hesitated for a moment. Mrs. Johnson was absolutely trustworthy, but revealing his plans could compromise the entire operation. "It's a personal project, something I need to do for myself. Can you arrange it?" "Of course, sir. How soon do you need all this?" "As soon as possible." And Mrs. Johnson, absolute confidentiality. Not even to Dr. Roberts. As Mrs. Johnson left to fulfill the requests, Edward called Mrs. Johnson. "Mrs. Johnson, will it be possible for you to watch the kids this afternoon? Also, I'll need to be out more often in the coming weeks. Nothing that affects the care of Michael and Ryan, but I might be late some nights." On the other end of the line, Mrs. Johnson felt a pang of concern. She had known Edward for 5 years and had never seen him act so mysteriously. "Of course, Mr. Smith. May I ask if everything is all right? You seem a bit different." "Everything is great, Mrs. Johnson. In fact, better than it has been in a long time. I'm just exploring some possibilities." After ending the call, Edward headed to the executive bathroom in his office and looked at his reflection in the mirror. The man, staring back, had less pronounced dark circles and a new spark in his eyes. For the first time in 2 years, he felt alive. 2 hours later, Edward was sitting at the same corner table of the corner cafe waiting for Emily. He had swapped his suit for jeans and a navy polo shirt, leaving the BMW in the parking lot of a nearby mall and walking to the meeting. "Sorry for the delay." Emily arrived breathless, carrying a heavy backpack and several rolls of paper. "I just came from a presentation that lasted 3 hours, a demanding client who changed their mind about the project for the 5th time. I can imagine how frustrating that must be," Edward said, standing up to help her with the materials. "Did you manage to close the deal?" "I did, but for a price far below what my work was worth." Emily sighed, sitting down at the table. "Sometimes I think about giving up freelancing and looking for a full-time job. At least I would have a guaranteed salary every month." Edward felt a pang of guilt. He could solve all of Emily's financial problems with a simple bank transfer, but that would completely destroy the purpose of his test. "But you enjoy what you do, right? It must be amazing to create things, to bring people's ideas to life." "I do," Emily smiled, ordering a coffee from the waitress. "And you? How's work in construction? It must be satisfying to see a building grow from nothing." Edward swallowed hard. He had spent the last few days studying operational functions in construction, preparing for questions like this. "I work as an engineering assistant at a mid-sized company. Nothing too glamorous. I mostly stay in the office, handling documentation, permits, those kinds of things. But you're right, it is rewarding to be part of the process." "What company?" Emily asked, genuinely interested. "Smith and Associates," Edward replied, using the fake surname he had adopted. "It's a family-owned business, kind of old-fashioned. The owner is a tough but fair guy." Emily nodded, taking a sip of her coffee. "At least you have stability. I live on the edge. I never know how much I'm going to earn next month." "And your daughter, how does she cope with this uncertainty?" Emily smiled tenderly when mentioning her daughter. "Lily is 16 and more mature than many adults. She understands the situation and even helps me with some things, but I worry. I want to give her a better life." "Does she live with you or with her father?" "With me." "Her father?" "Well, it's a complicated story. We divorced 3 years ago. He pays child support when he remembers, which isn't very often." Edward nodded, making a mental note about this information. Every detail of Emily's life was important to understand her motivations and desires. "And you? Do you have kids?" The question hit Edward like a punch in the stomach. For a moment, the image of Michael and Ryan sleeping in their cribs invaded his mind. "No," he lied, hating himself for it. "I've never found the right person to start a family." "Well, you're still young. You have time." "And you? Do you plan to get married again?" Emily pondered for a few moments, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. "I don't know. I suppose so, if I find someone who loves me for who I am, not for what I can offer. Someone honest, hard-working, who treats my daughter well." She looked directly into his eyes. Someone like you, perhaps. Edward felt his heart race. There was something in the way she spoke, in the sincerity of her eyes, that made him believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for finding true love. Emily, can I ask you a somewhat direct question? Sure. What would you do if you found out that someone you like isn't exactly who they say they are? Emily tilted her head, intrigued by the question. It depends. If it were a lie to protect me or the people they love, I would try to understand. But if it were out of dishonesty or to deceive me, that would be unacceptable. Edward nodded slowly. It was exactly the answer he expected and feared to hear. The apartment that Patricia had found was on the 3rd floor of a middle-class building on Pine Street. 2 bedrooms, a combined living room and kitchen, 1 bathroom, and a small laundry area. For Edward, used to the 4,300 square feet of his mansion, the space felt claustrophobic. But it was perfect for Edward Smith, the engineering assistant. "Will it work?" Patricia asked, watching Edward inspect each room with meticulous attention. "Perfectly. Did you set up all the utilities in the name of Edward Smith?" "Yes, sir. Electricity, water, gas, internet, everything. And the 2018 Honda Civic you requested is parked in the garage. Mileage consistent with a used car, but in good condition." Edward nodded, opening the small refrigerator that Patricia had stocked with basic items. Milk, eggs, bread, ham, cheese. A simple life he had never experienced. "Thank you, Patricia. Now I need you to keep my real schedule free every Wednesday and Friday afternoon, and some nights during the week. Make up external meetings or something." "Sir, may I make an observation?" Edward stopped organizing the simple clothes he had, bought polo shirts, jeans, casual sneakers, and looked at his secretary. "Whatever you're doing, it seems to be changing you. I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's the first time in 2 years I've seen you genuinely excited about something other than work or the kids." "It's good, Patricia. Believe me, it's very good." That night, Edward was in the kitchen of his mansion, trying to explain to Mrs. Johnson his new routine without revealing compromising details. "Mrs. Johnson, there are going to be some changes in the coming months. I'll be going out more, arriving late sometimes, but the boys will always be my top priority." Mrs. Johnson was preparing dinner, a shepherd's pie that reminded Edward of his childhood in the Midwest. She stopped peeling potatoes and looked at him with that maternal gaze he knew so well. "Mr. Smith, are you dating?" The direct question caught Edward off guard. "Why do you ask that?" "Because I've known you for 5 years. I can tell when you're worried about work, when you're sad thinking about Mrs. Laura, when you're tired because of the boys. But that sparkle in your eye, that's the sign of a man in love." Edward couldn't hide a smile. "It's complicated, Mrs. Johnson. Love is always complicated, my son. The question is she a good person?" "Yes, at least from what I know of her, she is." "Then why the secrecy? Why not bring her here to meet the boys?" Edward sighed, sitting on the stool at the kitchen island. "Because I need to be sure that she likes me for the man I am, not for what I have." Mrs. Johnson shook her head, immediately understanding the situation. "Oh, Mr. Smith, you're testing the girl. How did you—" "My son, I've worked for wealthy people for over 20 years. I've seen it all in this life. Patterns pretending to be poor to test employees. Children disguising themselves to see if their friends are genuine. You're not the first, and you won't be the last." Edward fell silent, absorbing Mrs. Johnson's words. "And do you know what the problem with these tests is, Mr. Smith?" Mrs. Johnson continued, returning to peeling the potatoes. "Sometimes we discover truths we don't want to accept. And sometimes the one who comes out changed from the test isn't the one being tested. It's the one doing the testing." But the next morning, Edward parked his Honda Civic in front of the corner cafe and checked his appearance in the rear-view mirror. faded jeans, a soccer team t-shirt, simple sneakers. Edward Smith was ready for another day. Emily was already waiting, this time accompanied by a beautiful teenager with long hair and green eyes identical to her mother's. "Edward, I want to introduce you to my daughter Lily." The girl extended her hand politely, but Edward noticed the typical assessing look of suspicious teenagers. "Nice to meet you, Lily. Your mother talks a lot about you." "Nice to meet you," she replied curtly. "Mum, can I go to the bookstore? You said I could pick a book." "Of course, sweetheart. I'll meet you there in an hour." After Lily walked away, Emily smiled apologetically. "Sorry for her coldness. She gets a bit wary with men I introduce." "How many have you introduced?" Edward asked, trying to sound casual. "You're the first in 3 years," Emily admitted, blushing slightly. "That's why she's so curious and defensive." Edward felt a mix of pride and responsibility. Being the first man Emily considered worthy of meeting her daughter was both an honor and a huge weight. "She has a point in being cautious. You two are everything to each other." "That's true. That's why—" Emily hesitated, nervously fiddling with her purse strap. "That's why I need to know that I can trust you, Edward." "You can trust me," he replied, immediately hating the irony of her words. "So tell me something about yourself that no one else knows." Edward swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" "Everyone has secrets, hidden dreams, fears they don't share with anyone. Share one of yours." Edward fell silent for a few moments, struggling internally. He could invent something, create another layer to his facade. But there was something in Emily's eyes, a genuine vulnerability that made him want to be as honest as possible within his limitations. He began, carefully choosing his words. "I'm afraid I'll never be enough for someone. That people like a version of me that isn't real." Emily placed her hand on the table. "Why do you feel that way?" "Because I've seen too many people change when they discover certain things about me, as if I suddenly became a different person." "What kind of things?" Edward felt he was walking on dangerous ground. "Things from the past, family, it's complicated." Emily nodded understandingly. "Everyone has a complicated past, Edward. I have my ghosts too." "What kind of ghosts?" "My ex-husband. He wasn't a bad person, but he was very ambitious, always wanted more money, more status, more recognition. In the end, Lily and I became obstacles to those goals." "What do you mean?" "He met a wealthier woman with better connections, someone who could help his career in a way I never could." Emily's voice lowered. "That's why I value simplicity and honesty more now. I'd much prefer a hard-working and sincere man over someone who lies to get what they want." Edward felt each word like a stab. Emily was describing exactly the kind of person he was pretending to be, in contrast to the kind of person he truly was. "And what if—" Edward took a deep breath. "What if you found out that someone you liked lied to you, but out of fear of losing you?" "It would depend on the lie," Emily replied thoughtfully. "Lying about feelings is one thing. Lying about who you are, that's something completely different." At that moment, Edward realized he had stepped into a trap of his own making. With each passing day, each moment of genuine connection with Emily, it became harder to imagine revealing the truth without destroying everything he was building. The sound of Emily's phone interrupted his thoughts. She answered with a worried expression. "Lily? What's wrong, sweetheart?" A pause. "What do you mean there's no money? I was sure that—" Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, don't buy the book today. We'll sort it out at home." Emily hung up the phone with a frustrated sigh. "Financial problems?" Edward asked, genuinely concerned. "The card was declined. I probably hit the limit without realizing." She forced a smile. It happens. We'll manage. Edward had to control himself from offering help immediately. Every fibre of his being wanted to solve that simple problem with a bank transfer. But Edward Smith, engineering assistant, would probably also have financial difficulties. Emily, if you need any help... No, Edward, thank you, but no. Lily and I always manage on our own, and we will continue to do so. The fierce independence in her voice made Edward admire her even more, but it also heightened his guilt for testing someone so principled with such elaborate lies. 3 months had passed since their first date, and Edward found himself torn between two completely distinct worlds. In the morning, he presided over meetings about million-dollar ventures. In the afternoon, he pretended to care about the price of gas for the 2018 Honda Civic. The emotional schizophrenia was beginning to take its toll. "Mr. Smith, are you sure you're okay?" Mrs. Johnson asked, watching him play with Michael and Ryan on the living room rug. "You seem a bit distant." Edward stopped making faces at the twins and looked at the housekeeper. She was right. His mind was constantly divided between his two lives. "Mrs. Johnson, can I ask you a strange question?" "Of course, my son." "Do you think it's possible for someone to fall in love with a false version of a person?" Mrs. Johnson frowned, sitting in the nearby armchair where Edward was playing with the kids. "It depends. Is the person being false on purpose or just hiding some things?" "Hiding many important things." "And why?" Edward sighed, picking up Ryan in his arms. The baby smiled and grabbed his glasses, nearly knocking them off. "Out of fear. Fear that if the person knows the truth, everything will change." Mrs. Johnson watched Edward closely. In 5 years of working for him, she had learned to read his expressions. "Mr. Smith, does this girl you're seeing, does she know you have children?" The question hit Edward like a slap in the face. He had lied about so many things that he had almost forgotten the most painful lie of all. "No," he admitted, avoiding Mrs. Johnson's gaze. "My kids..." Mrs. Johnson shook her head, disappointed. "Those boys are the most important thing in your life. How can you hide that? Because if she knows I have kids, she might be interested in me for the wrong reasons, or she might decide she doesn't want a relationship with someone who already has baggage. And what if she accepts the boys and likes them? What if she could be a good stepmother to them?" Edward hadn't considered that possibility. He was so focused on protecting his children that he hadn't thought they could also benefit from having a maternal figure in their lives. "It's complicated, Mrs. Johnson. Do you want old Mrs. Johnson's advice?" Edward nodded. "Lies have short legs, my son. Sooner or later she will find out, and the longer it takes, the worse it will be." That afternoon, Edward was in the Brooklyn apartment, preparing for a special dinner with Emily. She had landed an important contract with an advertising agency and wanted to celebrate. For the first time, she insisted on cooking for him. The false apartment was coming to life. Edward had spread fake photographs. In the house, he was with friends from work, actually hired actors, fake diplomas from technical courses, even utility bills with modest amounts strategically left on the kitchen table. The intercom rang at exactly 7 o'clock. "Edward, it's me, Emily." Edward opened the gate and waited in the hallway. Emily climbed the stairs carrying 2 grocery bags, wearing a simple yet elegant dress that highlighted her green eyes. "I hope you like lasagna," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "It's the only thing I know how to make well." "I love lasagna. And you didn't have to bring all this." "Of course I did. It's my celebration, remember?" Edward helped her with the bags, watching her explore the apartment with curiosity. "What a cozy place," she commented, noticing the photographs on the living room wall. "Are these your friends from work?" "They are. Nice people. We sometimes get together to watch football and drink beer." Emily smiled, heading to the kitchen. "It's great that you have close friends. I kind of lost touch with a lot of people after the divorce." As she cooked, Edward watched her graceful movements in the small kitchen. There was something deeply intimate and domestic about the scene, a normalcy he had never experienced in his mansion, where Mrs. Johnson took care of everything. "Emily, can I help you? You can peel these cloves of garlic for me." Edward grabbed the knife, trying to remember the few times he had seen Mrs. Johnson prepare elaborate dishes. Emily laughed when he struggled with the first clove of garlic. "You don't cook much, do you?" "No, I usually eat out or buy something ready-made." At least that was true. Edward rarely cooked, although for very different reasons than Edward Smith would have. "I'm going to have to teach you some basic recipes. Every man should know how to cook at least 5 dishes." "And what are?" "The 5 essentials." Emily laughed, counting on her fingers. "Rice and beans, pasta, scrambled eggs, grilled chicken, and instant noodles for emergencies." Edward laughed too, but inside he felt a pang of sadness. Emily was planning a future where she would teach him to cook, where they would build a simple and happy life together, all based on a gigantic lie. "Edward, can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure." "Why have you never gotten married? I mean, you're an amazing guy, hard-working, kind, funny. Some woman must have tried to tie you down." Edward stopped peeling the garlic carefully, choosing his words. "I've been in serious relationships a few times, but it never worked out. Why? I always ended up discovering that they wanted to change me. They wanted me to be someone I'm not." Emily stopped stirring the sauce and looked at him tenderly. "Edward, I would never want to change you. I like you just the way you are." The words were like a stab to Edward's chest. Emily liked Edward Smith, a man who didn't exist. "What if you discovered something about me that changed everything?" "Like what?" Edward took a deep breath. "What if I had lied about something important?" Emily turned off the heat and turned completely to him. "What kind of lie?" "Hypothetical. What if I'm not exactly who you think I am?" Emily was silent for a few moments, studying his face. "Edward, are you trying to tell me something?" Edward struggled internally. He could end everything right there, tell the truth, face the consequences. But the fear of losing her was greater than his courage. "No, I just sometimes think about how we build images of each other that may not be completely real." "We all wear masks, Edward. The important thing is that little by little we start to take those masks off. You've been showing me who you really are, and I really like what I see." At that moment, Edward's phone rang. It was Mrs. Johnson. "Excuse me, I need to take this. It's work." Edward stepped away to the bedroom. "Mrs. Johnson, what is it?" "Mr. Smith, sorry to bother you, but Ryan has a high fever. I've given him the medicine, but I think it's best for you to come back." Edward's heart raced. "What fever? How high?" 38.5. He's crying a lot and doesn't want to eat." "I'm on my way. If it gets worse, take him straight to the hospital." Edward hung up the phone and returned to the kitchen, where Emily was finishing preparing the lasagna. "Is everything okay?" she asked, noticing his worried expression. "I need to go. An emergency came up at work." "What kind of emergency at 8 o'clock at night?" Edward quickly improvised. "Problem at a construction site. A leak that could cause structural issues. I need to go check it out." Emily turned off the oven, clearly disappointed. "Can't it wait until tomorrow?" "Unfortunately not." "I'm sorry." "Emily, I promise I'll make it up to you." "It's fine," she said, although Edward could tell she wasn't completely convinced. "Be careful." Edward kissed her quickly and ran out, leaving behind not just the romantic dinner, but also the first seeds of suspicion in Emily's mind. During the drive to his real home, Edward realized he was treading on increasingly dangerous ground. The lies were multiplying, and maintaining 2 parallel lives was becoming almost impossible. When he arrived home and saw Ryan in Mrs. Johnson's arms, softly crying with a fever, Edward wondered if he was risking too much by keeping his children hidden from someone who was becoming increasingly important in his life. "How is he?" he asked, picking up the baby. "A little better. The fever has gone down to 37.8. Edward kissed his son's forehead, feeling the relief of being home with his real family, away from the complications of his invented life. But still, he couldn't stop thinking about Emily, alone in the apartment, saving a lasagna she had lovingly made for a man who might never have truly existed. The coffee was cooling in the cup as Edward watched Emily from across the table. 2 weeks had passed since the interrupted dinner, and he noticed a subtle change in her behavior. The questions were becoming more direct, the looks more investigative. "Edward, you never took me to your job," she commented, absently stirring the sugar. "It would be nice to meet your office, your colleagues for real." Edward swallowed hard. He had dreaded this moment. "The company is pretty strict about visits. Security issues, you know how it is." "Security for a construction company? We have confidential projects, contracts with the government, things like that." Emily nodded, but Edward noticed she wasn't completely convinced. "And where exactly is it? You never told me the address." "In the Fifth Avenue area, just a regular office building, nothing special." "Which building? I know the area well. I work with several clients there." Edward felt cold sweat trickle down his back. Each question was a potential trap. "It's on Fifth Avenue. You probably don't know it. It's an older building." Emily slightly furrowed her brow but didn't press the issue. Edward quickly changed the subject. "How is Lily? She seemed a bit distant last weekend." "She's investigating you." The statement hit Edward like a bolt of lightning. "What do you mean?" "Kids today are savvy with the internet. She tried to find you on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. She got curious because you have no digital presence." Edward had been careful about that, but he hadn't thought a 16-year-old would be so perceptive. "I don't like social media. I think it's a waste of time." That's what I told her. But you know how young people are. They find it strange for someone not to exist online. And what else did she investigate? "She asked if I had ever been to your house, if I knew. Your family, your friends. When I said no, she said that was suspicious." Edward forced a laugh. "Your daughter has a future as a detective." "Edward," Emily's voice grew more serious, "is there something you're not telling me?" The moment Edward had feared the most had arrived. He looked into Emily's green eyes and saw not just curiosity, but also a vulnerability that made him hate himself even more. "Emily, we all have things from the past that we prefer not to talk about. But I told you about my ex-husband, about my financial problems, about my insecurities. You know, me inside out. I feel like I only know pieces of you." Edward took her hand across the table. "You know what matters. My feelings for you are real. But what about the rest? Your family, your dreams, your fears. Sometimes I feel like you invented a life just to impress me." The irony of Emily's words was brutal. Edward tried to maintain a calm expression, but inside he felt his world crumbling. Why would I invent a humble life to impress someone? I don't know. That's why I'm asking. But that night, Edward was in his office at the DT mansion, working late to make up for the hours he spent living as Edward Smith. Mrs. Johnson had put the twins to bed and was organizing the kitchen when she noticed the light on. "Mr. Edward, aren't you going to sleep?" "In a few minutes, Mrs. Johnson." She approached the office door, noticing the several empty coffee cups on the table. "May I come in?" Edward gestured for her to sit in the armchair across from his desk. "How are things with the girl?" Mrs. Johnson asked directly. Edward sighed, removing his glasses and massaging his temples. "Complicated. She's starting to suspect. And what are you going to do?" "I don't know. If I tell the truth now, I'll lose her. If I keep lying, I'll lose her anyway when she finds out." Mrs. Johnson was silent for a few moments, watching Edward struggle with his internal demons. "Mr. Edward, may I say something as someone who cares about you?" "Of course. You're being unfair to that girl." Edward looked up, surprised by Mrs. Johnson's frankness. "What do you mean?" "She's falling for someone who doesn't exist. And when she finds out the truth, because she will find out, these things always come to light. She'll feel deceived and used. But my feelings are real. Your feelings, yes, but your whole life is a lie. How will she trust you after that?" Edward knew Mrs. Johnson was right, but the fear of losing her was paralyzing. "What if she's only interested in my money? What if she isn't? Have you thought about that? What if she's really a good person who cares about Edward for real, not about rich Edward or poor Edward?" Mrs. Johnson stood up to leave, but paused at the door. "You know what? You worries me more, Mr. Edward." "What?" "The boys. One day they're going to ask why Dad lied about them. How are you going to explain that you hid their existence from someone you loved?" Mrs. Johnson's words echoed in Edward's mind for hours. When he finally went to sleep, he found Ryan awake in the crib, looking at him with those huge blue eyes. "Dad messed up, didn't he?" he whispered, picking up his son. "Dad is afraid that people won't really like him." Ryan babbled something incomprehensible, but gripped Edward's finger tightly, as he always did. "You two are the most important thing in my life. How can I hide this from someone I want to be part of our family?" The next day, Edward was at the fake apartment waiting for Emily to arrive for lunch when his phone rang. It was Patricia. "Sir, we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "Forbes wants to do a feature on the most successful young entrepreneurs in New York City. Your name is on the list. They want to schedule an interview for next week." Edward closed his eyes. His picture in a national magazine would be the end of Edward Smith. "Cancel it. Make up some excuse." "Sir, this is the third important feature we've cancelled this year. It's drawing attention. Dr. Roberts mentioned that the company's marketing is suffering." Edward sighed. His real life was starting to interfere with his fake life in ways. "Patricia, I need you to do one more thing for me. Hire a discreet private investigator. I want a complete investigation on Emily Brown, a graphic designer living in Brooklyn." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, are you sure? Won't this go against the purpose of your project?" Edward hated the idea, but paranoia was taking over him. What if Emily was conducting her own investigation? What if she already knew who he really was? "I'm sure. I want to know everything about her. Financial history, past relationships, everything." "How much time do I have?" "A week." Edward hung up the phone and looked at himself in the apartment mirror. The man staring back had deep, dark circles and a tortured expression. He was becoming someone he didn't recognize. Paranoid, manipulative, willing to invade the privacy of the woman he loved. When Emily arrived for lunch, Edward noticed that she also looked tired. There was something different in her eyes, a distance that hadn't been there before. "Are you okay?" he asked, kissing her on the cheek. "Edward, I need to tell you something." Edward's heart raced. "What?" "Lily. She hired a hacker friend to investigate you." Edward felt the world spin around him. "She did what?" "Couldn't find anything. It's as if Edward Smith didn't exist before 6 months ago." Edward swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. "Emily, this is an invasion of privacy. I know, I've talked to her about it, but Edward..." Emily looked him straight in the eye. Why is there no record of you online? No old bank accounts, no work history, no photos on social media with friends? Edward realized he was cornered. Patricia had been careful in creating Edward Smith's identity, but there was no way to fabricate a complete story that could withstand a determined investigation. Emily, Who are you, really, Edward? The question hung in the air between them, laden with distrust, fear, and yet hope. Edward looked at the woman he had learned to love and realized the moment of truth had arrived. But would he be brave enough to tell her? Edward remained silent for long seconds, watching the tense expression on Emily's face. The small apartment felt even smaller, the walls closing in around him like a trap he had built himself. Emily, I can explain. Then explain. Her voice was firm, but Edward could see tears forming in her green eyes. Because at this moment, I'm starting to think that even your name isn't real. Edward stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, watching the movement of the street below. Normal people living normal lives without needing to build elaborate facades to find love. My name is Edward, that is true. And the rest? The company, the job, this whole life you've shown me? Edward turned to her, seeing the pain in her face. In that moment, he realized he had become exactly the kind of man Emily feared the most, someone who lied to get what he wanted. Emily, if I tell you the truth, will you promise to listen until the end? Depends on the truth. Edward took a deep breath, knowing there was no turning back. I don't work as an engineering assistant. What? A surprise, she replied with bitter sarcasm. I have a company, a construction firm. Emily frowned. You own a construction firm. I do, and it's successful. How successful? Edward hesitated. It was like jumping off a cliff. Once he leaped, there was no going back. Very successful. We are one of the largest in the state. Emily stood up from her chair, her eyes widening as the implications of Edward's words became clear. You're rich. I am. Very rich. Yes. Emily began to pace back and forth in the small kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. And this apartment? This simple life you showed me? It's false. I live in a mansion on the Upper East Side. Jesus Christ, she murmured, running her hands through her hair. You lied about everything. Not about everything. My feelings for you are real. Real. Emily turned to him, her eyes now shining with anger. How can I believe anything you say? You built an entire false life. Because I needed to know. Know what? If you would be interested in me for who I am, not for what I have. Emily stopped pacing and looked at him with an expression that mixed disbelief and disdain. So this was a test. I was a guinea pig in your social experiment. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Emily raised her voice. You decided I was potentially gold-digging and set up an elaborate ruse to test me, as if I were some kind of potential criminal. Edward tried to step closer, but she backed away. Emily, please let me explain. Explain what? That you made a fool of me for months? That you laughed at me every time I worried about your financial difficulties? That you watched me like a lab rat to see how I would react? It wasn't like that. I fell in love with you. Did you fall in love with me or with the version of me that passed your test? The question hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He had never thought of it from that angle. Emily, what else have you hidden from me? Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you have another secret family somewhere? Edward fell silent, and Emily immediately realized she had touched another sensitive point. My God, she whispered, you have kids. Emily, do you have kids? She shouted. I do, Edward admitted, his voice barely audible. Emily leaned against the kitchen counter as if she had received a physical blow. How many? 2, twins, 8 months old. 8 months, she repeated, calculating mentally. When were they born? Edward hesitated, realizing where she was headed. In April of last year. We met 4 months ago, Edward. You hid from me that you have babies this whole time. I wanted to tell, but what? Did you think I wouldn't pass the test if I knew you had kids? Edward didn't respond, confirming Emily's suspicions. And their mother? Where is she? She died, cancer, 2 years ago. For the first time since the conversation began, Emily showed a flicker of compassion in her eyes. Edward, are you a widower? I am. Emily sat heavily in the chair, trying to process all the information. So you are a single father, widowed millionaire, who decided to test me by pretending to be an ordinary worker to see if I was a gold digger. When you put it that way, that's exactly what it is. She exploded again. You lied about absolutely everything that matters. Your job, your financial situation, your family. What kind of relationship is this based on lies? Edward sat in the opposite chair, finally facing the magnitude of what he had done. Emily, I know I made a mistake. A mistake? Edward, you built a complete false identity. You rented an apartment, bought a used car, invented an entire life. This isn't a mistake, it's emotional fraud. I was scared. Scared of what? That I would be a gold digger? That I wanted your kids for money? You judged me before even knowing me. Edward realized there were no arguments that could justify what he had done. Emily was right. He had judged and condemned her before even knowing what kind of person she was. What's worse, Emily continued, tears now flowing freely down her face, is that you made me question my own sanity. Every time I felt something was off, you made me think I was being paranoid. Emily, please! And Lily, my daughter investigated you because she felt something was wrong. She's 16 and was smarter than I was. Edward stood up and tried to touch Emily's arm, but she pulled away sharply. Don't touch me, not now. What can I do to fix this? Emily stared at him with red eyes from crying. You don't understand, Edward. There's no way to fix it. How can I trust you after this? How can I believe any word that comes out of your mouth? Because I love you. You love a version of me that passed your test. I fell in love with a man who doesn't exist. Emily grabbed her bag and headed for the door. Emily, where are you going? Home. I need to think. I need to process all of this. Can I call you? She paused with her hand on the doorknob and turned to him one last time. Edward, at this moment, I don't even know what your real name is. How can I want you to call me? Edward Smith. That's my real name. Edward Smith, she repeated as if testing the sound. It's ironic. I met Edward Silver and fell in love with him. Edward Smith is a complete stranger. And with those words, she left the apartment, leaving Edward alone with the wreckage of his elaborate facade. Edward stood in the middle of the living room for long minutes, listening to the echo of Emily's footsteps going down the stairs. The apartment, which had been his refuge and his prison for the last few months, now felt just empty and false. He picked up his phone and called Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson, I'm going home. So early. Did something happen? Edward looked around the apartment one last time. Yes, the truth happened. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the apartment, and Edward had not heard from Emily. He had called countless times, sent messages, even passed by the corner cafe in hopes of seeing her, but she had simply vanished from his life. Mr. Smith, you need to eat something, Mrs. Johnson said, placing a plate of food in front of him on the kitchen table. You're losing too much weight. Edward looked at the plate, disinterested. The last few days had been a blur of work meetings that he could barely concentrate on, and sleepless nights taking care of the twins, who seemed to feel their father's emotional tension. Mrs. Johnson, can I ask you a question? Of course, my son. Do you think I'm a bad person? Mrs. Johnson sat next to him, drying her hands on her apron. You're not a bad person, but you did something very wrong. She'll never forgive me, will she? I don't know, Mr. Smith. I just know that if it were me, it would take a long time to trust again. Edward nodded sadly. Mrs. Johnson was always brutally honest, a quality he appreciated even when it hurt. The boys miss her, don't they? Mrs. Johnson asked. Edward looked at her in surprise. How so? They never met her. No, but they miss the dad you were when you were with her. You were lighter, happier. Kids feel those things. As if called by the conversation, Michael began to cry upstairs, soon followed by Ryan. I'll go, Edward said, getting up from the table. In the twins' room, Edward found both awake in the crib, crying for no apparent reason. He picked up Michael, trying to calm him. Daddy messed everything up, didn't he? He murmured, gently rocking the baby. Daddy was scared and now lost someone very special. Ryan reached out his little arms, wanting to be held too. Edward sat in the rocking chair that Sarah had chosen, holding both of his sons. You deserve to have a mother, he continued, his voice choked, and I ruined the chance for you to meet an amazing woman. It was at that moment that his phone rang. Edward looked at the screen and his heart raced. It was Emily. Hello? Edward? Her voice sounded different, more controlled. Emily, thank you for calling. How are you? Can I come to your house? Edward almost dropped Ryan. To my house? To your real house, in the Upper East Side. Of course, when? Now, I just left home. I'll arrive in 40 minutes. Emily, are you sure I can come to you? Edward, I need to see, with my own eyes, how you really live. Send the address. Edward spent the next 40 minutes in total panic. He instructed Mrs. Johnson on what to say if Emily asked questions, checked to see if there was anything compromising around the house, and even hid some of the more expensive artwork to avoid looking too ostentatious. Mr. Smith, relax, said Mrs. Johnson, watching him rearrange the living room for the third time. If she came here, it's because she wants to give it a chance, or she came to give me an ultimatum. Either way, be honest. Only the truth can save you now. When the doorbell rang, Edward nearly stumbled as he rushed to answer. Through the video intercom, he saw Emily standing in front of the main gate, looking impressed by the mansion's facade. Come in. Follow the path to the main entrance. Edward waited for her at the door, trying to see his property through Emily's eyes. The landscaped garden, the Italian fountain, the contemporary mansion itself. Everything must seem excessive to someone struggling to pay the bills. Emily parked in the circular driveway and slowly got out, taking in every detail. She was dressed, simply jeans and a white blouse, but Edward had never found her more beautiful. Impressive, she said, approaching. So this is how Edward Smith really lives. Emily, show me the house. Edward led her through the main room, observing her reactions. Emily touched the expensive furniture, examined the paintings on the walls, absorbing every detail without making comments. And your kids, where are they? Upstairs with Mrs. Johnson. Do you want to meet them? Emily hesitated for a moment. Yes. Edward took her to the twins' room, where Mrs. Johnson was playing with Michael and Ryan on the carpet. Upon seeing them, Edward realized he had forgotten to prepare Mrs. Johnson for the meeting. Mrs. Johnson, this is Emily. Emily, this is Mrs. Johnson, who takes care of the boys. Mrs. Johnson stood up, extending her hand with a warm smile. Nice to meet you, girl. I've heard a lot about you. Emily shook Mrs. Johnson's hand and then knelt beside the carpet, watching the babies. They're beautiful, she murmured, gently touching Ryan's face. Just like their father. Ryan is quieter, said Mrs. Johnson. "Michael is more mischievous, always wanting to be held." As if he understood, he was being introduced. Michael crawled over to Emily and tried to climb into her lap. She picked him up naturally, and the baby immediately started playing with her hair. "Do they miss their mother?" Emily asked, looking at Edward. "They were born premature. Sarah died when they were just 2 weeks old. They never really got to know her." Emily nodded, though Edward noticed tears forming in her eyes. "Mrs. Johnson, can you give us a few minutes?" "Of course. I'll prepare a snack for you." When they were alone, Emily continued playing with Michael while Ryan watched curiously. "Edward, can I ask you some questions?" "Anything." "Why did you really do this? What was the trigger?" Edward sat on the floor beside her, holding Ryan in his lap. After Sarah died, several women showed up interested. Neighbors offering help, acquaintances from work, even her friends. But I realized that they all knew who I was, how much I had. I never had the experience of meeting someone who was interested in me without knowing anything about my financial situation. And you decided I was suspicious even before meeting me. That's not it. Yes, it was, Edward. You saw me as a potential threat, a possible gold digger. You condemned me before the trial. Edward had no way to deny it. Emily was absolutely right. Emily, I know I made a terrible mistake. More than a mistake. You violated my trust in a way I never thought anyone could. Michael started to whimper, and Emily instinctively rocked him, calming him. The maternal gesture did not go unnoticed by Edward. "But I need to tell you something," Emily continued, not looking at him. "What?" "I knew." Edward felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. "What do you mean?" 6 weeks ago, I hired a private investigator to look into you." "You... what?" "After that dinner you cancelled at the last minute, some things didn't add up. The inconsistencies in your stories, the complete lack of digital presence, the way you sometimes talked about money." Edward was in total shock. "And what did you find out?" "Everything. Your real name, your company, this house, your children." Emily finally looked at him. "The death of your wife." "And why didn't you confront me earlier?" "Because I was conducting my own test." Edward stared at her, trying to process what he was hearing. "What kind of test?" "I wanted to know if you would have the courage to be honest with me, if you could trust me enough to tell the truth. And I failed. Spectacularly." They sat in silence for a few moments, just watching the babies. Michael had fallen asleep in Emily's arms while Ryan played with Edward's fingers. "Emily, what does this mean? For us?" "I don't know. I'm trying to decide if I can forgive someone who lied to me about absolutely everything that matters. And if I promise never to lie to you again." "How can I believe your promises after this?" Edward realized he was fighting an almost impossible battle. Trust, once broken, was infinitely harder to rebuild than to build from scratch. "What can I do?" Emily looked at Michael, sleeping in her arms, then at Ryan, smiling at his father. "I don't know if there's anything you can do, Edward. Maybe the damage is irreversible." At that moment, Edward realized that the test he had created to find out if Emily would truly love him had turned into a very different test, whether he would be able to win back the love he had lost through his own lies. 2 weeks passed since Emily's visit to the mansion, and Edward couldn't get the image of her holding Michael so naturally out of his head. Mrs. Johnson had commented several times on how the twins seemed different that day, calmer, as if they felt the nurturing female presence. "Mr. Smith," the girl called, Mrs. Johnson said, entering the office where Edward was working. Edward immediately lifted his head from the papers. "When? What did she say?" "Just now. She asked if she could come here this afternoon. She said she needs to talk." Edward felt his heart race. How did she seem? determined, different from the last time. At 3 in the afternoon, Emily arrived at the mansion accompanied by Lily. Edward was surprised to see the teenager. It was the first time she had come to his house. "Edward," Emily greeted formally, "this is Lily. You already know her, but now she knows who you really are." Lily observed everything with curious and slightly suspicious eyes. "So you're the man who lied to my mother for months." "Lily," Emily reprimanded. "No, Emily, she's right," Edward said. "Yes, Lily. I lied to your mother, and I apologize for that, both to her and to you." "Why?" Lily asked directly. "Why create an entire life?" Edward took a deep breath. If he wanted a second chance with Emily, he would also have to earn the trust of her daughter. "Because I was scared. My wife died and left me alone with 2 babies. I didn't know how to trust someone new. And you decided to test my mother as if she were a criminal." "Lily, please," Emily tried to intervene. "No, she can ask," Edward said. "You're right, Lily. I judged your mother before getting to know her, and that was wrong." Lily studied him for a few moments. "Do you want to meet your children?" The question caught Edward off guard. "Would you like that?" "If I'm going to have to accept you in my mother's life, I think you should meet the whole family." Edward looked at Emily, who nodded slightly. "Mrs. Johnson," he called. "Can you bring the boys?" When Mrs. Johnson appeared with Michael and Ryan, Lily approached cautiously. "They are smaller than I imagined." "They're 10 months old now," Edward explained. "This is Michael, more energetic, and this is Ryan, more observant." Lily extended her finger to Ryan, who immediately grabbed it. "Hi, Ryan, I'm Lily." Then she turned to Michael. "And you must be the little troublemaker of the family." Michael laughed and clapped his hands, drawing an involuntary smile from Lily. "They're cute," she admitted, "but they must be a lot of work." "They are, but they're my life." Lily watched Edward playing with the boys for a few minutes before turning to Emily. "Mum, can I talk to you privately?" Mother and daughter stepped away to the garden, leaving Edward anxious in the living room. Mrs. Johnson took the opportunity to approach. "The girl is smart. She's testing you too." "What do you think she's telling Emily?" "I think she's giving her opinion. And by the way she looked at the boys, it wasn't a completely negative opinion." 15 minutes later, Emily and Lily returned. The teenager seemed to have made a decision. "Edward, can I ask you a very direct question?" "Of course." "If my mother gives you a second chance, will you lie again?" "Never." "How can I be sure?" Edward thought carefully about his answer. "You can't. I can only promise and prove it with actions, not words." Lily nodded, seeming to approve of the honesty of the answer. "Mum, you can talk to him alone now. I'll stay here playing with the babies and Mrs. Johnson." Emily looked surprised at her daughter. "Are you sure?" "I am. But I want you to talk here in the living room where I can see. No secret conversations." Edward almost smiled at Lily's protective attitude. The girl was definitely Emily's daughter. Emily sat on the sofa, and Edward chose an armchair nearby, keeping a respectful distance. "Edward, I've spent these 2 weeks thinking a lot about our situation. And did you come to any conclusions?" "Several. First, you hurt me deeply. Second, you violated my trust in an almost unforgivable way. Third, despite all of this, I couldn't stop thinking about you and your children." Edward felt a spark of hope. "Fourth," Emily continued, "I realized that I also made mistakes. I should have confronted you about my suspicions instead of hiring a private investigator." "Emily, you didn't make any mistakes." "I did. We were both playing games instead of having an honest conversation." Edward nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "So where does that leave us?" Emily took a deep breath. "I want to try again, but with conditions." "Any condition." "First, no more lies. Not small ones, not big ones, no omissions. Total transparency. I accept. Second, you will go to therapy. You need to work on your fears and distrust before they destroy any chance of a healthy relationship. Edward hesitated for a moment. Therapy meant confronting issues he had avoided since Sarah's death. I accept. Third, we'll take it slow. Very slow. Rebuilding trust takes time. How much time do you need? I don't know. It could be months, it could be years. Are you willing to wait? Edward looked at Lily playing with the twins, at Mrs. Johnson smiling approvingly, at Emily waiting for his answer with a mix of hope and fear in her eyes. Emily, I would wait a lifetime for you. And do you accept that Lily will be an integral part of this process? She will be watching everything, giving her opinion, and protecting me if she feels you're lying again? Edward looked at the teenager who had stopped playing and was obviously listening to the conversation. Lily, he called. What? She replied, feigning innocence. Do you accept to be my honesty supervisor? Lily smiled for the first time since she arrived. I accept, but if you lie again, you'll have to deal with me. Deal? Emily finally smiled too. Then I think we can try to start over, from scratch, as if we were meeting for the first time. Edward stood up and formally extended his hand. Edward Smith, businessman, father of twins, widower for 2 years, ex-liar in recovery. Emily laughed and shook his hand. Emily Brown, graphic designer, mother of a teenager too smart for her own good, ex-victim of emotional manipulation. Pleasure to meet you, Emily Brown. The pleasure is mine, Edward Smith, but this time it's a real pleasure. At that moment, Michael crawled to Edward's feet. Emily raised her arms, asking to be picked up. Lily naturally took her in her arms, and the baby immediately snuggled close. I think someone approves of the fresh start, Mrs. Johnson observed. Lily approached with Ryan in her arms. Mum, they are really adorable. And Edward, they clearly need a mother. Lily, Emily scolded, blushing. It's true, and you need someone who truly loves you. Just no more lies. Edward looked at the scene, Emily with Michael, Lily with Ryan, Mrs. Johnson smiling like a proud grandmother. For the first time in months, he could envision a real future built on truth instead of lies. Emily? Thank you for giving me a second chance. Don't thank me yet. You'll have to earn it. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it if necessary. Lily rolled her eyes. You adults are so dramatic. Let's see if you can make this work without any more psychological games. Edward laughed, realizing that winning over Lily would be just as important as winning back Emily. But for the first time in a long while, he felt he had a real family within reach, if he was brave enough to be completely honest. 3 months had passed since Edward and Emily's fresh start. Their relationship was carefully evolving, with supervised meetings by Lily and long conversations about trust and transparency. Edward had started therapy. The lies were a thing of the past, and the twins were already calling Emily Mom, their attempt to pronounce mother. On a Saturday morning, Mrs. Johnson was organizing the boys' toys when she found Emily in the kitchen making coffee for everyone. Dear, can I say something? Mrs. Johnson said, with that tone indicating a serious conversation. Of course, Mrs. Johnson. What is it? Do you remember when you first came here, when Edward told the truth? Emily stopped stirring the sugar into the coffee. I remember. Why? You said you knew who he was for weeks, that you had hired a private investigator. Yes, that's true. Mrs. Johnson sat at the kitchen table, studying Emily carefully. Dear, I've worked for wealthy families my whole life. I know when someone is hiding something. Emily, who felt her heart race. What are you talking about, Mrs. Johnson? You knew who Edward was, even before you hired the investigator, didn't you? The silence that followed was answer enough. Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. I thought so. How did you find out? Emily sighed, sitting in the opposite chair. I worked for Laura's ex-husband's family. Mrs. Johnson's eyes widened. What do you mean? 5 years ago, when I was still married, I did some design work for Laura's father-in-law's company. I met her a few times at social events. My God, when I saw Edward at the cafe that first day, I didn't recognize him immediately. But when he said his name was Edward Smith and that he worked in construction, something clicked in my mind. Mrs. Johnson was processing the information. And you investigated? I Googled him. I found pictures of him in articles about the company. That's when I realized who he really was. And why didn't you tell him? Emily got up and walked to the window, watching Edward play with the twins in the yard. Because I was curious. Why was a rich man pretending to be poor? What kind of game was he playing? So you decided to play too. At first, yes, but then... Emily turned to Mrs. Johnson. Then I fell in love with Edward Smith, the kind, hard-working man who cared about money and had simple dreams. I fell in love with the version of him that didn't exist. Mrs. Johnson fell silent, absorbing the irony of the situation. When I hired the investigator, it wasn't to find out who he was. It was to confirm details about his life that I already knew. I wanted to understand why he was doing that. And did you find out? That he was testing if I was materialistic, which made me furious because I knew from the start who he was and still became interested in his poor version. Mrs. Johnson shook her head, impressed by the complexity of the situation. Dear, does that mean you two were lying to each other? In different ways, but yes. And now, you both started over based on total honesty, but you're still hiding this from him. Emily sat back down, looking weighed down by the burden of the secret. I know, it's hypocritical of me, but Mrs. Johnson, how am I going to tell him that I knew who he was from day one, that I let him torture himself with guilt for months, knowing that I already knew the whole truth? And what if he finds out on his own? He won't find out. The only person who could connect the dots is... Who is it? Emily hesitated. Laura's sister. She saw me a few times at events, but we haven't been in touch for years. At that moment, the intercom rang. Mrs. Johnson went to answer it. Hello? Good afternoon. I'm Helen Roberts. I would like to speak with Edward Smith, Mrs. Johnson looked at Emily, who instantly paled. Helen Roberts, Emily whispered. It's Laura's sister. Mrs. Johnson returned to the intercom. One moment, please. Emily, do you know this woman? I do, and if she sees me here, will she recognize you? Absolutely. Mrs. Johnson, she can't see me here. Edward will find out everything. Mrs. Johnson thought quickly. Go to the boys' room. Stay there until she leaves. Emily ran upstairs while Mrs. Johnson returned to the intercom. You can come in. Please follow the main path. Mrs. Johnson went to the yard, where Edward was teaching Michael to walk. Mr. Smith, you have a visitor. Helen Roberts. Edward frowned. Laura's sister. How strange. We haven't spoken in months. She's coming up the path. Edward handed Michael to Mrs. Johnson. Where's Emily? She went to check on how Ryan is sleeping. Edward didn't question it, heading for the front entrance. Helen Roberts was in her late 40s, elegantly dressed, with a serious expression that Edward recognized well. No need, came a voice from the doorway. Lily was standing in the hallway, backpack on her back and a determined expression on her face. I heard the conversation with Aunt Helen. Lily, Emily began. Mom, you lied to him just like he lied to you. The teenager's blunt statement echoed through the silent room. It's more complicated than that, sweetheart. No, it isn't. Lily stepped into the room and positioned herself between Edward and Emily. You both are adults who have been playing cat and mouse instead of having an honest conversation from the start. Edward watched the young girl, impressed by her maturity. "Lily, you're right. I know I am. The question is, are you both going to keep playing these games, or are you going to stop and decide if you really want to be together?" Emily looked at Edward, then at the twins sleeping in her arms. "Edward, I need you to know something very important." "What now?" he asked, fearing more revelations. "When I fell in love with Edward Smith, I wasn't pretending. Those feelings were real. And when I met Michael and Ryan," Emily kissed the forehead of each baby, "I fell in love with them too, with you as a family. But knowing the whole truth about who I was, yes, and choosing to like the simpler version of you." Edward fell silent for long moments, watching Emily with her children, Lily waiting for a response, Mrs. Johnson standing in the doorway with a concerned maternal expression. "Emily," he finally said, "can I ask you a question?" "Any question." "If we had met normally, without lies from either side, would you have been interested in me?" Emily smiled for the first time since Helen had arrived. "Edward, do you remember how it was at social events? Impeccable suit, conversations about business, always surrounded by important people." "I remember. It was intimidating, unreachable. I would never have the courage to approach someone like Edward Smith." "But Edward Smith. Edward Smith was human, vulnerable, real. He was someone I could love." Lily stepped closer and touched Edward's shoulder. "Edward, can I give you some advice?" "Sure. Stop trying to decide who lied more or who did worse. You both made mistakes. You both forgave each other. The question is, do you love each other enough to truly start over this time?" Edward looked at Emily, who held her children as if they were her own. He looked at Lily, who had become the voice of reason in all this confusion. He looked at Mrs. Johnson, who smiled encouragingly. From the door, "Emily, do you really want to start over, knowing everything now?" "I do. But this time, without Edward Smith or Edward Santana, I want to know the real Edward, neither the cold businessman nor the invented worker, the devoted father, the man who is afraid of not being loved for who he truly is. And what if we find out that we don't really know each other? Then we will get to know each other. For real. No tests, no lies, no games." Lily clapped her hands softly. "Finally, two adults acting like adults." Mrs. Johnson laughed from the door. "The girl is right. You both complicated something simple too much." Edward stood up and extended his hand to Emily. "Emily Brown, my name is Edward Smith. I'm 38 years old. I'm a businessman, widower, father of 10-month-old twins. I've made many mistakes out of fear, but I'm trying to be a better person. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow?" Emily laughed, shaking her head at the sleeping babies. "Edward Smith, my name is Emily Brown. I'm 35 years old. I'm a graphic designer, divorced, mother of a teenager who is wiser than both of us combined. I've also made mistakes out of fear, but I want to learn to trust again. Yes, I would love to have dinner with you." "And this time," said Lily, "no fake apartments, invented identities or secret investigations. Just you two being yourselves." "Agreed," they both said in unison. Michael stirred in Emily's arms and opened his little eyes, sleepily looking around. "Mom," he mumbled, focusing on Emily's face. "Hi, my love," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Mom is here." Edward felt his eyes fill with tears. For the first time in 2 years, he could envision a future where his children would have a real mother, where he would have a true partner, and where everyone could be exactly who they were, without masks or pretensions. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I think we are finally going to have a complete family." "Thank God," replied Mrs. Johnson, wiping her own eyes. "And thanks to Lily, who has more sense than both of you combined." Lily smiled proudly. Someone had to be the adult in this house. At that moment, Ryan also woke up and, seeing everyone gathered around his chair, gave a huge, toothless smile and clapped his hands. "I think he approves," said Emily, laughing through her tears. "We all approve," said Edward, finally allowing himself to believe that, after so many lies and painful truths, they had found something real and lasting. Outside, the sun was setting over New York City, painting the sky in gold and pink, while inside the mansion on the Upper East Side, a non-traditional yet true family was finally beginning to form, built not on fortunes or appearances, but on love, forgiveness, and the courage to be vulnerable.